All right, y'all, we're back for another edition of Are You a Robot podcast, videocast. Today I'm joined by none other than Sasha, who I'm going to let give a brief intro about herself and what she's working on before we jump into the full conversation.
Hi, I'm Sasha Luccioni. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Mila Institute in Montreal, and I work on AI for Humanity initiatives.
So if this is your first time tuning in, welcome to Are You a Robot? If this is not your first time, then welcome back. We are a series that aims to tackle and explore some of the greatest questions that stem from AI and related technologies. The way that we're going about doing this is by bringing on some of the best and brightest minds that we can find in their respective fields, and they talk to me about what they're doing and if there are any best practices or if they have any strong opinions on how we can move forward in a harmonious way. The conversations don't stop here, though. I would love to invite you into our Slack channel, which you can find all the links for below in the links. And there we're creating quite a vibrant community around AI ethics and AI governance. We love every time someone joins new. So please jump in there, join us. We would love to have you and your voice and hear what you're working on, hear what your thoughts are with AI ethics and anything that is around these kind of technologies. So the last thing I will mention is that we've got an incredible sponsor. EthicsGrade is an AI benchmarking firm, and they are responsible for the high quality and high caliber of guests that we have on this show. So I have to thank them very much for doing that hard work and finding some of these bright minds. If you would like to find out more about what they are doing, click the link below. Or if you would like to get your company benchmarked to see how ethical you are being in the AI department, definitely check out the links below and give them a shout. So without further ado, we have got Sasha Luccioni with us today. Let's hear what she has to say.
Are you a robot?
Sasha, thank you so much for coming on to the Are You a Robot podcast and videocast. I'm very excited to have you here.
It's great to be here.
So today I want to talk about so many different things. I have so many avenues that we can go down because you are an incredible person when it comes to AI, and especially using AI in a very ethical way with respect to climate change and our carbon footprint. But before we get into any of that, I think it would probably be helpful for listeners to know how you came to be where you're at.
It's actually been a really long road. So I got my PhD almost 4 years ago, and I spent 2 years working in companies, essentially trying to learn applied AI, growing essentially in that direction. And then after 2 years of that, I realized that my heart lays in more ethical applications, in AI for good. So I quit my job. I was working at Morgan Stanley at the time, and it's been 2 years that I've been at Mila Institute, and it was a big change, and it was really a following my heart kind of moment. But I'm really glad I did it, and I'm glad that I kind of made that leap of faith, and I can pursue things that I really care about now.
Yeah, and you mentioned Mila. Can you give us a bit more background on what that is and what you're doing there?
Yeah, so Mila is a pretty cool place. It's an AI research institute in Montreal, and it brings together researchers from different universities, different companies, essentially. it's supposed to be one of the biggest non for profit gathering of machine learning researchers in the world. So essentially, we've got, I think now, almost 500 people working in AI. So a lot of fundamental research, but also a lot of kind of AI ethics, philosophical things. So it's a really nice melting pot.
Yeah. And I imagine for most of the listeners out there, they've probably heard of it because it is quite a thought leader when it comes to AI ethics. I know they have great papers that are being put out, they have incredible research that's being done, like you said. So I'm wondering, in your own words, how would you describe to us what exactly it is that you do?
So I do a lot of things, but essentially, AI for humanity, I find, is a good way to sum it up. It's a bit above AI for good. It's more, thinking about and also kind of acting on how to use AI in a positive way for society. So
Mm.
anything from actual applied research projects, which I do work on, but also creating tools. For example, the carbon calculator tool, and also participating in discussions around ethical frameworks. So it kind of runs the scope of all that. But the conducting kind of the main thought is that how can we use this really powerful tool, this really great potential in order to benefit humanity, to benefit society.
Hmm. Yeah. And I like how you take the approach of making sure that with all of the hype that AI brings, it we don't get wrapped up in that and like just lose sight of some foundational things. Like when you speak about, hey, is it really the best idea to be training these machine learning algorithms on this huge resource just so that it can do simple tasks like put together a Rubik's Cube, where everyone on the internet says, yeah, all right, cool. Wow, that's amazing that we've come so far. But then people don't realize what's behind that.
Yeah, and it's an environmental problem, of course, and that's kind of the angle that we've taken, but it's also a broader societal problem. I think that because of the increasing size of models, the increasing computational power that you need, I mean, yeah, it's bad for the environment, but it's also very hard for people to get a foot in the door now. Like, if you need 100 GPUs just to compete with the state of the art, that's an issue, right? We don't want
Mm.
AI to become this elitist field where you need $500,000 in cloud computing credits to even be able to compete on a leaderboard. So it's also kind of this, we should focus on things that are easier for people to get behind, so that we have new voices. Because if we do that, we're going to have the same people with money, with power, who keep on making the state of the art, and then it's going to be harder and harder to kind of be part of that momentum. And that's what we don't want. We want that new people to come in. We want new blood, new ideas, and that's kind of what I've been advocating.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and it actually reminds me of a talk that I had a while back with a friend, and he was talking about how really the important thing for machine learning right now, when we start to see it becoming more and more commoditized, is that you need these subject matter experts that are going to have this deep, deep knowledge, whether it's a doctor or a lawyer that's going to explain how the machine learning needs to work. And to your point of, well, if you can just spend a couple $1,000,000 and be the leader, but you don't think about anything that is the baggage that's behind that, like the cloud computing costs, then it's really it's a delicate trade-off, right? So I think there's one thing also that you mentioned a few minutes ago, which was the cloud computing cost, or sorry, the AI. What was it? The AI compute cost that
Yeah,
you
the
built?
cloud. I mean, it depends on whether you have like local infrastructure or in the cloud. Most people use the cloud just because they don't have 500 GPUs where they are.
Yeah. And so you built something. I just before we started talking, you have something on GitHub, right? That is showing how much carbon you expend when you train a model.
Yeah,
Is
so
that
we
how it
created
works?
a tool called Code Carbon, and the idea is that essentially whatever script you're running, whatever program, it could be it could be AI, but it could be something like any kind of essentially computer program. It's like a little widget that runs in the background, and it detects essentially what energy grid you're connected to, and
Mm.
that's like the main factor of how polluting you are. So, for example, here in Montreal, we have hydroelectricity, so it's very low carbon. But if you're, I don't know, in Singapore, for example, it's almost 100% coal based. So just
Mm.
that like single factor, by detecting where you are, it's gonna give you an idea of how much CO2 you're emitting per kilowatt hour of electricity. And then it also detects how long you were running a script and like how many parallel processes you have. And in the end, it spits out an estimate. It's an estimate for sure of how much CO2 you emitted. And so it's just to give you an idea of like, for example, if you are running on the cloud and you have a choice of where you run your algorithm, especially if you're running for like a month, which a lot of
Yeah.
AI now needs, it can be like it could be tons and tons of carbon if you make that choice between like Quebec and Singapore in terms of CO2. So it's essentially like a really easy tool that people can use just to get an idea of how much CO2 they're emitting in their code.
Yeah, and just letting people be more conscientious
Yeah.
of where they're doing it. And do you also give a map of where you get better or more environmentally friendly grids?
Yeah. So what we do is we give a map of the world, and we show in relative to like whatever you're like emitting, where you could go like lower. So for example,
Oh,
if I'm in
awesome.
Quebec, it's really hard to emit even less than hydro. But if you're in like a middle ground, you can always choose a country that's less emitting. And what we did is we essentially mapped out where the main cloud providers have their servers. So like Amazon,
Yes.
Google Cloud, etc. And we can say like, well, if you're using Google Cloud, so this is what you can use that's less emitting. If you're using Amazon, it would be here, right? Because they don't always have the same places, like the same
Uh-huh.
servers in the same places. So, and then if you're using a local grid, then there's other steps you can take, like for example, like have less of a grid search for parameters for your model. So it's also like more in having a more mindful practice of machine learning, not being just like, I'm just going to run it for a month and see what happens. Like just be a bit more conscientious about that.
Yeah, yeah, and that makes total sense. And it's very nice that you raise the issue, even because before you talk about it, I think for many of these engineers, it's easy to not even think about that, right? It's just like, oh, well, I've got infinite scale and infinite compute on my cloud, and you don't think about these secondary effects.
Yeah,
And
and this was brought up actually by Emma Strubel in 2019. They published a paper. They did one study about like they actually essentially trained a model from scratch and showed how much CO2 it emits, and that was kind of the trigger because a lot of people were like, "Whoa, this one model emits as much as 5 cars." But how about the other models we trained? But there were no tools in order to estimate it, right? Unless you would write your own script from scratch, which is really
mm,
difficult. So this is why we decided to make this calculator, because I think a lot of people care, but it's really hard to get the numbers. And I think as scientists, as engineers, we really want to get like, the nitty gritty details about like, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about a gram or are we talking about like a ton, right? And this is why we made the tool to give people an order of magnitude of the CO2 emissions they emit.
yeah, that's fascinating. And I feel like it has applications beyond just the AI world, right? I've heard horror stories of people working in databases and they did some kind of join, and then the boss came down the line like 2 days later saying, "Hey, what have you been up to? Because we got like this $40,000 bill that we don't know why, and it's looking like it's coming from you." And so I think this is a really important theme that you're touching on, is that these days we have infinite or infinite computing abilities,
Yeah.
right? If you have the money, you can compute like crazy. But is that the proper way? Like, just because we can, should we?
Yeah. I think mindfulness is a big point. And I think I truly believe that if people had the numbers, that they would make to take the necessary steps. So often it's really coming from a place of like, I don't understand the impact, which is okay, right? Like for the longest time, we didn't understand the impact of many of our actions on the environment. Like now we know that, I don't know, microplastics are bad, right? So it's really like, it's a human journey, and hopefully like we contributed to part of that journey in giving computing practitioners this tool, whether they're database administrators or machine learning experts.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's a a very useful tool. So tell me more about what you're doing, because I know you got all kinds of cool stuff going on. What other stuff are you working on?
So in general, so actually 2 years ago, almost, we wrote this paper called Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning. So we were like 20 authors on it. And it's interesting because, so we created an association around it. We created a group of people called Climate Change AI. So I'm
Mm.
involved in that. And we do research, but we also organize events. We try to bring together people, and I think that moving the needle on climate change with machine learning is a lot, like you said, connecting with domain experts. And often, if you're coming from just a pure machine learning or AI background, you don't really know who those experts are, right? You're like, oh,
Mm.
I want to
Yeah.
optimize an electricity grid, and then you just download some data and like whatever. And we've seen a lot of that, and so now we're really trying to connect people with the relevant experts to build multidisciplinary projects. So we're really like connecting the dots on this. And I'm head of the content committee of Climate Change AI, and essentially we're making resources, we're making tutorials, we're making I don't know, all these data sets. We're curating data sets that people can actually use. So the idea is, if people want to get involved, we're trying to give them the tools that they need to get involved so that people don't feel like they're just alone against this like massive monster of climate change. So essentially, yeah, we're trying to create like a minimum viable mass of people who want to get involved. And it's been really encouraging.
That is incredible. And it made me think about something that is a little bit ironic. I would imagine that you're almost like, so you're playing both sides of machine learning for good for climate. Like you're helping people understand their costs and how detrimental training a machine learning model can be, right, to the environment. But then there's also the other side of like, hey, I've heard a lot of people saying we can use machine learning to help us with climate change, right? And I just thought about some ironic pieces of that. Like if someone was trying to use machine learning for the environment or to help us with climate change, and then the learning model that they were training was actually doing more harm than good. And sorry, I got my daughter jumping in here.
Yeah,
She
no
wants to say
worries.
hi.
Hey. So I think it is a trade-off. It's not quite the same ballpark. Like there's relatively few machine learning models that emit really like huge amounts of CO2. So essentially, I see it as two sides of the same coin. So creating a tool so people understand their impact and making sure that you're comparing apples to apples. Like so, I'm working on a project that aims to, I don't know, detect methane emissions, and so I want to make sure that the methane emissions that I'm detecting are proportional, like are more than the model itself. But honestly, in most cases, in climate change related projects, because we're not training neural networks from scratch, because we're not trying to because essentially where most of the CO2 comes in machine learning research is hyperparameter search. So essentially you're training like a model of so many times in order to find the right parameters to apply to your data set, for example. A lot less of that is done in climate change research because you're often trying to apply techniques. You're not trying to like reinvent the wheel. You're taking an existing architecture and you're tweaking it, or you're using it on a different data set and things like that. So it's not quite the same order of magnitude of emissions as like training a GPT model from scratch. Like
Mm.
it's not quite there yet. But of course, it's important to be aware, right? To essentially compare cost and benefit in any case, even if it's not essentially the same scale.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, like, what are some things that you have been finding that machine learning is very useful for, like how to combat climate change?
There's so many. So, for example, remote sensing has been a big part. So now we have access to a lot of satellite imagery of the Earth, and
Mhm.
traditionally, it's been manually analyzed, but it's not really a scalable approach. So, a lot of
Mhm.
techniques are using remote sensing data, and it's interesting because you can use images, but you can also use lidar, which is essentially 3D radar mapping. You can use infrared. You can use the whole spectrum of imagery in order to detect, for example, methane leaks. Like You won't see it on an image. You won't necessarily see it on, a LiDAR, but then you will see it in the infrared spectrum. And then if you essentially compare these three sources together, you can pinpoint where the leak is, using the map plus the satellite imagery plus the infrared imagery together. And then you'll see that, I don't know, somewhere in the Arctic, there's a methane leak. So there's interesting like ways of putting together data sets that haven't necessarily been put together using machine learning that I find is particularly powerful. And since machine learning can crunch a lot of data, it's not like you can really utilize and essentially have insights that we didn't have from a single source of data.
Yeah, that is a great point. And thinking about how useful it is, and to the point of scale, right? This was trying to be done before, but now we can do it at a much larger scale and with much more data. So that is also really encouraging to hear. I know that you are a National Geographic explorer too. So maybe you could tell us a bit about what's going on there and your love for, I guess it makes complete sense, your love for the environment, your love for the planet. And so can you give us a bit of background on that?
Yeah, so the National Geographic Explorer program has been going on for a few years, but for a while now. In the last couple of years, they started giving out grants specifically in using AI for Earth. So I got a grant for my project of visualizing climate change with AI from National Geographic. And essentially, what that means is that, you go through a filtering process, and essentially National Geographic says that they believe in your project and that they're ready to support it financially. They're ready to kind of help it go to the next level. And a lot of the projects are really interesting, right? People go out and gather data in the field, and they'll, do tracking of endangered species, things like that. So essentially, National Geographic supports this research, and what it entails is that you become kind of an advocate. You become, you get a platform for connecting to other people, for getting training, for getting.
Amazing.
It's really cool. It's really a great support group, and also for us, because our project is so visual. Having National Geographic support is especially important because they're going to help us disseminate our website. They're going to help us make sure that it gets seen by the maximum number of people. It reaches the maximum number of people.
And this is a different project than the one you were just speaking about the methane?
Yeah. I mean, the methane project is just an example. It's not my own research. The project that I'm working on now is essentially using generative networks, so GANs, in order to help people imagine the future consequences of climate change. So the idea is, right now we have the ability to act on climate change in the future, right? But it's really hard to imagine what climate change can do to our planet, because essentially right now things are kind of okay, right? They're kind of subtly getting worse, but not that it's not that obvious to us. And as it's like the frog in the the water that's getting hotter and hotter. It's at a certain point it's going to be boiling. We're not going to realize. And so what we're trying to do is kind of help people project themselves in a future where climate change is impacting our planet, is impacting the places we live and the places we hold close to our hearts. And I mean, it's a hypothetical scenario, right? Because we don't know exactly how climate change is going to impact, I don't know, wherever you live, wherever you travel. But we have an idea of what's going on already, right? There's already flooding, there's already smog and wildfires. And so what we're doing is we're creating images of like a potential future climate, and essentially as a warning, as an awareness raising tool to say, hey, this is going to happen. It's going to happen maybe in 50 years, maybe in 10 years. We don't know that yet, but we have to act now to make sure that doesn't happen. So it's like an educational tool using AI.
So Sasha, you seem very like an optimistic person, and you're working on this every day, and it sounds very depressing.
It's depressing, but I think, I've come to the conclusion that I think people are very well intentioned. Like, I know that talking to people care about climate change, people realize it's an issue, right? But when it comes to acting on it, to actually changing the way that, either we eat, travel, vote, because it's like an all-encompassing thing. It's just not enough to give up meat one day of the week. You have to actually, vote for people who are going to take action. You have to, stop taking the plane 50 times a year, or, in a post-corona world. So essentially, we have to make these changes. And I think what it would take, this is based on actual research in psychology saying that showing this kind of imagery, showing these kind of very visceral images helps people overcome cognitive bias. So this has been proven for example, saving up for retirement. There was this experiment that showing people aged versions of themselves helps people save for retirement. Like if I show you a picture of you in 50 years, like, a generated
Face
one.
app. Is that where they came up with that idea? That was
It
very
was
hot.
it was a group of psychology researchers. Essentially, they did a study, and then they'll ask people like, how much do you want to save for your retirement this month? And by showing them that image of them old, they would save up like 5 or 10 times more for their retirement savings because all of a
Wow.
sudden it became more concrete, right? So this is kind of what we're basing ourselves on. Like it's like an aging version of the planet to help people imagine.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. I could see that. And so there are some really difficult images, I'm sure, that you're producing. And I didn't quite get how you're producing them. It's with a GAN
Yeah.
that is, and so it's just basically aging the planet in a way that the machine learning is aging the planet before our eyes. Is that how it works?
Essentially, we're using is like essentially you input an address and we get the Google Street View image of that address, and then we apply a GAN that will make different projections. So it will make a flooding projection, it's going to make a wildfire projection, and a smog projection, which are based on real images of these phenomena. So essentially we trained our networks on a lot of images of flooding, a lot of images of wildfires, etc. And the idea is that, well, this is like a place that you chose, a place that right? It could be your house, it could be whatever, your work, and this is what could happen to it if if these extreme climate events happened. And essentially, we're going to show real events of climate change. So, for example, like a flood in Australia or wildfire in California, right? Like these are the events that are happening already, but they're just not where you're searching for. So this is what it would happen if this wildfire from California came to your backyard, if this flood from Australia flooded your street, right? The idea is like all of these events are so far away that for us it's kind of abstract, but we're making them more concrete.
And is it safe to say then that nowhere is safe? Because I'm sure people will argue, oh yeah, but I
Live on a
live
hill.
in the, yeah, exactly.
Well, it's
And
true that nowhere is safe in the sense that it's unpredictable. So, of course, flooding can only happen in certain areas. Wildfires can only happen in certain areas. But sooner or later, the climate's going to change in a way that every place on Earth is going to be impacted in a different way, to a different extent. And of course, like people can hide in New Zealand until that happens, but sooner or later it's going to be in New Zealand too. So the idea is to act before that happens, because there are feedback loops that can start. There are certain things that we can't even predict, right? If we hit a certain degree of warming, we don't even know what the impacts are going to be on the Arctic ice, right? On the sea level rise. So that's kind of the issue. I think that the IPCC does a very good job of communicating the risks, but there's still it's still scientific terms, right? It's like the risk of blah, blah, blah is this. It's very abstract. People don't really understand it. But when you make it visual, all of a sudden it becomes more concrete. This is what 1.5 degrees means. This is what 4 degrees means, right? And so, of course, we don't know exactly where we're heading, but we know that it's going to be like a global phenomenon. And maybe, maybe there's going to be a minority of people, especially privileged global north, right? People who have money to buy to build barrages or whatnot. Of course, maybe that's going to be the case, but 95% of the global population that doesn't have the money to do that is going to be impacted, and that's an issue.
great points you're bringing up here. I wonder about the ideas that you were speaking to before, with how it's not enough to just say, yeah, I really think global warming is horrible and give it lip service, but to act and make choices and lead your life from this point. I mean, I think we all at this point in life or in the world and where we're at right now, we understand that it is quite a detrimental thing for the environment, but we don't have clear signs to what we can do. And you mentioned like not eating meat because, and so this might even just be news for some people, that the whole meat industry is putting out an incredible amount of carbon
Greenhouse gas.
emissions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I know because a few years ago I was teaching English in Spain, and we would have like a session on global warming, and I would ask them, what are the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases? And people would always say cars and transport, but no one ever said farms.
Yeah,
And
agriculture.
yeah, yeah. And so it's something that back to kind of the question that I'm thinking about here is, have you thrown around the idea of AI helping people make better choices?
Yeah, actually, there are tools that try to do that. So I guess the main barrier is that it's very context specific. So depending on where
Mm,
you live, depending on what your daily routine is like, it's a different action that can be taken, right? For example, yeah, so in Quebec, maybe unplugging appliances that we don't use is less impactful just because the energy is so low carbon. But in another place, that could be the single most impactful thing, like improving the isolation in your home and unplugging appliances that you don't use just because you're on a coal powered grid. But on the flip side, maybe where I live, because I drive a pickup truck, that would be the most, And then in another place, it's because So it's really hard because you need to kind of take into account contextual factors in order to do this kind of best step. But there are people working on this, essentially like creating apps that people can use in order to, for example, kind of measure their lifestyle emissions and then say, well, based on what I've been gathering, the data I've been gathering in the last whatever month about like what you do, how you travel, etc. This is like the single best thing you can do, because
mm,
otherwise you kind of get into these generic things which are kind of not necessarily applicable in some cases, right? So
exactly.
it's really important to pinpoint and to gather the data. I think gathering the data is a really important factor, because otherwise we're just basing ourselves on averages. Like in the country that you live in, the average is this, right? But it doesn't
Mm,
mean that it's representative of you. And there's so many things to be done, right? From your diet to buying clothes that or throwing away or not recycling, right? There's so many aspects to it that I think that people just, it's hard to understand the relativism of like giving up meat once a week is equivalent to not or driving 50 kilometers in your car, right? It's really hard to make these equivalences across the board.
yeah. And I've heard that if you show people in images, it's very helpful.
Yes, I think images, and then a big part of our website is going to be acting. So like when you see the image, we're going to have a big act now button, and then
Mm,
you're going to have a choice of actions that you can take. And so we're actually basing ourselves on several different sources. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. So there's this project called Drawdown that
mhm,
actually tried to crunch the numbers on this, and so they were working on more of a global scale, right? So it's like if everyone adopted a plant-based diet, if everyone, for example, decarbonized the transportation sector. So we're trying to bring that down on an individual level, because
mhm.
if I tell you, oh well, if everyone goes vegan, then global warming is done, right? You're like, but
Yeah.
what does that mean for me? Because if I don't do it, and then my neighbor doesn't do it, right, and then nothing happens. So we're trying to bring it
Mhm.
down on an individual level and say, okay, well, if you do it, then this is going to be the consequence. So because I think people also think that it's also a tragedy of the commons.
Yep.
It's like, right,
I
like
was
it's,
just going to say that.
no one really does it, and so action never gets taken. So we're trying to kind of overcome the tragedy of the commons.
Yeah, which is a difficult feat in itself.
Yeah.
And so then, are you going to be putting, like, in this act now, is it going to be something like, hey, well, if I stop eating meat for just one day a week, which is nothing for most people, like, that is not that difficult to do, right? And then you show them, or you give them equivalents of
Mhm.
what that would be equal to, and then you give them pictures, and you try to overcome that through visual stimulus again.
Yeah, yeah. So the idea is that, so first on the website, people will learn about climate change, what it means, and then you enter an address, you see kind of the images, and then you're going to have like an act now, and I mean, it's really hard to exactly quantify, like to give you like I don't know, 100 grams of CO2 per day you don't eat meat, right?
Yeah.
So it's most like more like an average of for example, like if you do eat a steak every Monday, if you stopped eating that steak, we could tell you, right? So
Mm.
and the idea is also to give people kind of different choices. And something we've been toying around with that I really like is the idea of a time capsule. So say you say today,
Mm.
I want to do meatless Monday or whatever, meatless Friday. And then you can send an email to yourself that will arrive in a month that will check up on it and say,
Oh,
okay, in the
cool.
last month, have you actually been doing what you yourself said you would do, right? We're not actually forcing you to commit to anything, but like just to give yourself kind of like a more, because I think that essentially it's up to us to follow up on ourselves, but typically we're really bad at that, right? Like, someone will say they'll stop drinking or smoking and then, go back, fall off the wagon. So the idea is
Yeah.
to kind of add a degree of accountability, but like self accountability.
Mm. Yeah. The accountability is crucial. And it's really a lot coming down to habits and how we form habits and how we break habits. And that is, I mean, books, libraries are full of books that speak about that, right? So it's a really fascinating subject. And I think that it's incredible you're doing that. And instantly what I wonder is it already lost on the older generations? Like, will it help people that are already set in their ways and that don't really care that much to change? And I instantly think like, oh, this will be great for children, but I wonder about the older generations.
I mean, from a very kind of skeptical, I mean, it's a bit rough to say this, but what matters are the younger generations at this point. Like, we're not going to try to convince someone who's pushing 60, and who grew up in a time. It's also kind of, if you put things relatively speaking, right? When they were 20 or 18 or 5, it wasn't an issue. So it's really hard for someone who's older to care about things that just were sprung on them the last 20 years of their life. So we're
Mm.
really aiming to get younger generations. So I mean, more like from 16 to 35, because the next 20 years, I mean, also the past 20 years, but the next 20 years are really crucial. So the people who are coming of age in the next years, the people who are going to be taking positions of power, right? Like the next prime minister of Canada, the next president of the US, this is who we need to be on board, because the people who are retired and first of all, it's they're not necessarily in positions of power anymore, right? Especially the older generations, but the younger generations do have this critical mass that they can still, and they can also transmit this, right? If a
Mm.
16-year-old uses our website and then they share it on TikTok or whatever, then someone else will use it, and that's the idea. Also, we're creating like kind of social media widgets that you can like share on Facebook or whatever, saying, "Hey, this is my house underwater. What would
Oh,
yours
yeah.
look like?" And then so to create this viable mass and this viral mass that's not necessarily going to be used by older people, which is fine. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that. And there's some valid points in there. It's something that for these people, it's not really they're not going to be the ones that deal with it as much as the younger generations.
Yeah,
So
and that's
there's
been
a
a that's been an issue for a while, because the people who bear the brunt of our actions are not necessarily us or our future us or our future hypothetical children if we don't have children. And it's also, so human biases. There's the bias of distance. Things are far away from us, we think that are less of a risk. This is why, like, this is the way we just evolved, right? And then
yeah.
there's also the time. We have a discounting factor. So if I say, would you prefer $100 now or $100 in a month, or even $200 in a month? People will tend to say $100 now, right? Because things
Yeah.
that are hypothetical in the future, abstract. And so this has been a big barrier in acting on climate change, because we think that there's no way that my actions in 2021 will impact the state of the planet in 2050. But it will, right? So we're trying
Mhm.
to make that missing link and to kind of help people project themselves into the future, saying, yeah, it's not your actions in 2050 or your kids' actions in 2050 that are going to decide the fate of the planet. It's your actions now that are actually going to, have repercussions.
Yeah, and again to that point, like it seems so far away. So who knows where I'll be in 2050?
Right.
So like, why does that even matter? When I get to 2050, then talk to me about it. But
Exactly.
that's obviously not the way to go about it. And so I'm noticing that you you seem very well versed in these psychology studies. And is there a trend here? Like, do you read a lot about that so that you can try and optimize what is your projects, like the effects or the outcomes of your projects, or is that just something that I'm making up?
Well, I did my master's in cognitive science, so I did study kind of the psychological aspects of humans to a certain extent, but also, I mean, I believe in essentially the people I work with believe that it's really important when you're working in on a project that can have an impact in a certain way. You have to understand that impact. You have to understand the studies that were done. You have to understand, for example, there has been extensive work on climate communication, on climate psychology. Like this, these are actual fields of research. People do
Mm,
experiments on this. So we spent a lot of time at the beginning of our project researching this, and like there are people, for example, who focus on imagery of climate change, like who have been for 20 years studying, if I show you an image of a polar bear on an ice cap, are you gonna go vegan? If I show you an image of
mm,
a wind farm or a solar farm, are you gonna go vegan? Right, there's been extensive research upon like positive versus negative, personal versus impersonal, abstract, concrete. There's a lot of research on this, and so reading this research, we positioned our project saying that, okay, it seems like personal images are more impactful than impersonal ones. It seems like,
mm.
um, for example, images of climate change impacts help people understand consequences. Like they're like we've actually found this niche that AI can help tackle, because otherwise, like, how are you going to generate a bespoke image for each person in your experimental protocol, right? Like for a psychologist, like it's
Yeah.
impossible, right? You just show an image of a kind of a suburban looking house and say, well, this is a suburban looking house and you live in a suburban looking house. But what we can do is actually say, this is your house, right? This is your house on fire. And so we're kind of like taking it to the next step and saying we're building on these decades of research and using AI as a tool to the next step.
Can you walk me through how you even landed upon this, like the project? Because I think it's fascinating, first of all, that you realize this is what we need to do. So let's dive in and research what is the most effective way of doing that. But I'd love to know maybe just how did that seed, like what was the first why, and what was the first what can we do that will make the biggest impact, and how did the project evolve from there?
So essentially, this was like an idea that was brought forth by the supervisor of our project, so Joshua Bengio, who's kind of one of the pioneers of machine learning, and he came to this idea because GANs started being quite good a few years ago, and he had this thought of, what if we could use GANs to visualize the impacts of climate change? And this was kind of like just a kind of a thought that he had, and then when we started working on the project, we realized that it made so much sense given like the research that was already done. So it was actually pretty
Mm,
intuitive. But we also realized that there are certain things that are counterproductive to show. So we spent a lot of time figuring out like how do you channel surprise or shock or awe in a way that's productive. And so like acting on something, it's really important. Like if you show someone something, I don't know, like for example, you have an image on a cigarette pack, right, of someone dying from lung cancer, but you have to channel that. You have to say, well, call this hotline and try to
mhm.
quit smoking. Like if you just show someone something very graphical and very scary, they can just become frozen and not act. So we spend a lot of time kind of talking to psychologists, reading studies, and formulating things. And I think what's really important in projects that aim to have an impact on society is to see the broader scope, to not focus on, oh, we're just going to create a super cool GAN that does super cool things, but more like, what does that imply? What are the puzzle pieces that we're not seeing? Let's talk to people and see what they say, right? And that's something that's often overlooked because these studies can be dense to read. Like we're not used to this kind
Mhm.
of jargon. Like I don't know what they're talking about when they talk about whatever psychological phenomenon. So it's like you have to unravel the string, the spool, until you understand what's going on, and then go back to your own project with kind of this new baggage, this new research.
Yeah, and the understanding that comes from it.
Yeah.
So that seems like a great way to go about it. And can you tell me, in your eyes, as we're looking to the future, hypothetical future, like where do you feel there is a need for potentially, like, because I think I read in the Wired article you were quoted in about how you would like to see people or companies including in their footnotes, hey, these algorithms that are being used were trained, or they emitted X amount of carbon, right? And they take responsibility for that. What other things, I wonder, would you like to see happening within the machine learning and the AI community to be more ethical about this and help combat climate change?
So I think that I see climate change as part of a larger ethical problem in machine learning. Reproducibility is a big part. So the fact that we don't have foolproof ways. I mean, we're starting, but we're not there yet of reproducing research. And so, like for example, I'm helping organize a reproducibility challenge where people essentially try to reproduce results from previous years to see if essentially if it works on new data, if it works right, if you can actually, if it was just a fluke or if it was just like a super fine tuning of on a certain use case and data set. So I think
Mm.
reproducibility is part of it. And I'm, my big aspiration in life is to introduce new metrics into the mix, because currently we're really focused on accuracy, performance, 99%, whatever.
Yeah,
But
F
like
score,
when I
F1
see a
score.
paper that says we trained our network for another 2 weeks on another 1,000 or 100,000 images and we got 0.5% better on state of the art, I find that so frustrating, because it's like, okay, well maybe, yeah, 99.5% is better than 99, but above and beyond the carbon you emit, but is it really worth this kind of little incremental improvement to do all this work and all this computing and all this effort? So I think that there's a really pressing need to integrate socio-technical metrics into the machine learning community, and to make it a bit more subtle, to make it a bit, more, yeah, encompassing other things other than accuracy, things like fairness, things like environmental impact, things like, to say, okay, well, we got zero point 0.5 accuracy, which cost us X and Y and blah 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 in terms of CO2 computing and whatnot,
Mhm.
right? So to kind of do this trade-off, because otherwise we're just kind of optimizing for a single metric, and then this direction is the only direction we're seeing.
Yeah, that just makes me remember chat I was having last week about how the guy I was talking to, Noah Gift, he was mentioning how Google has been optimizing for these metrics, right? They've gotten the smartest people in the room for years and years and years. And look at where that's got us. Like, it's got us with people that will stay on YouTube and then go down to a YouTube hole, or go down a YouTube hole and then believe that, QAnon kind of conspiracy theory stuff.
Or
And
doom scroll through whatever
exactly.
feed,
And
yeah.
that's because of this optimization for watch time, or
Yeah.
these things
Or
that, and
likes.
yeah, or
Or
likes, and we
yeah.
don't take a step back and we don't see the bigger picture, and we don't say, like, what are we actually doing this for? What and I think that's a really great point of these papers that are being written, and they tout that, oh, look, we got zero point 0.5 better accuracy when we trained it for 2 more weeks. But the aspects, or again, these side effects that aren't being stated, I wonder, like, how can you introduce that kind of culture into the machine learning scientific community?
It's starting. Last year, NeurIPS already made it mandatory to have a societal impact statement when you submit. NeurIPS is the largest machine learning conference, and essentially now I mean, it was kind of abrupt. Like all of a sudden, a couple of months before the deadline, they said now everyone who submits needs a societal impact statement. And I know that at Mila, people were like, "What? What does that mean? Like, what are we supposed to be doing? I don't know anything about anything, right?" And so people were panicking. And I think the first year, maybe it's not going to be the most profound statements. People are just like, well, if someone uses my algorithm in like predictive policing, it's bad, right? Or something kind of a bit shallow. But I think that it's going to become a process. People are going to, you know, also, for example, what I did a lot at Mila was having conversations with people and trying to help them think through the impacts of their algorithm. But of course, like I couldn't cover all 500 people, but people who did reach out to me because I kind of talk about this a lot, so people know that I'm interested in it. So they reached out and said, okay, can we like take half an hour to talk about potential societal implications? And then I took like a bunch of these meetings with people, and I think it really helped. But what we need is also kind of to take a step back and to have ethical training, to have people at least gain awareness of the fact that, you know, these things are relevant, these concepts are relevant. You can't just pretend that ethics is not part of the problem, that environment is not part of the problem. So like, for example, in engineering training, right, in education, you take an ethics class when you become an engineer. I think in most countries you have to take a class about ethics. You can't ignore it. And I think we should start having things like that in AI as well, because as soon as your products get used in society, you have to think about those impacts, and you have to factor them in to whatever work you're doing, to whatever engineering or research you're doing. So I'm a firm advocate of ethical training or awareness raising in the ML community.
Yeah, that echoes a lot of the same sentiment that we've had from people on here quite a bit. I mean, it is necessary, and they don't need to get a PhD in ethics, but at least to have a bit of training and have that the like devil on your shoulder when you're creating your machine learning model, and then later 10 years later shit hits the fan and you go, oh, we never could have seen this coming. How would we have known that this was going to create such a stir, right? So that is a huge point.
And now, for example, I'm teaching a machine learning 101 class. I'm lecturing this semester, and undergraduates have never taken machine learning before, but I always try to take a step back. And even, for example, we were talking about supervised machine learning, and then we were talking about a case where, I don't know, it was just like one of those kind of like cookie cutter problems where you're predicting how whether a house in the real estate market will sell fast or not, like something like super kind of neutral, you know, quote unquote. Yeah. And then I was like, well, you know, someone labeled this data. Like, how did they label this data? Like, what constitutes like a house that sells fast? You know, maybe it actually depends on like brokers, or it depends on seasons, or it depends on other things that are not part of your data set. And then these kids, I think, got super confused because, you know, you're used to being like, oh, this is the data, this is what I'm predicting. I'm predicting the label. And then all of a sudden, you know, Professor Sasha or whatever starts telling them about how maybe they should be thinking outside the box. And, you know, I tried to go back on it and be like, well, maybe we shouldn't think about this right now. But I actually like modified the curriculum to add an ethical class at the end. But I was just like, you know, when you look at data, don't take it as a given. Don't think that this is like God's truth on earth. Think about it as part of the picture, as one vision of the picture, and also be critical. Like, say like, well, you know, I've, you know, bought a house or rented an apartment. I think it's missing like this factor, right? And like to try to be critical about the data and the tools you used is part of being a machine learning practitioner. You can't just like plug in a model, plug in some data, and then think that it works. No, you have
game
to
over.
think
Let's
about
go
it.
home.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, maybe it was a bit too rough on them at the beginning, but I think that this is the type of things that we should be thinking about from the get-go when we do machine learning.
That is a very important point, to be critical of the data. How much you need to question the data and make sure that whatever data you are getting is not just, like you said, you're not just taking it and saying, okay, here's the truth. This is the data says it, so it's got to be true, right? So that's huge. Now, since you are quite informed about what's going on in the world of AI and machine learning, I'm wondering, what are some cases of machine learning right now and AI that you are a little bit worried about?
Oh, big language models, definitely. GPT worries me.
Really?
Yeah, because I mean, it's an interesting innovation, I guess. But I think that, so I have a bachelor's in linguistics. So for the first couple of years of my university studies, I studied language and the way it's structured, the way that it conveys meaning, like all of these things from a really formal perspective. And I feel like the way that NLP, I mean, natural language processing, is going nowadays, it's like more data, bigger models, screw the language structures, screw whatever's going on under the hood. We just have this model that can like carry on a conversation or generate some text. And it's like, for me, as you know, I have this kind of linguistic baggage from way back when, but still I'm like, guys, like we should be thinking about this. We can't just say GPT-3 can, imitate or can represent all of language. Like that's just not true. It's no way. There's no way that's true. And I mean, even if you like poke it a bit, and if you like query it with terms, like we were playing around with different names. Like they've got this thing where you can like generate a Humans of New York story based on a name or whatever. And
Uh,
depending on the name that you input, like if it's
oh
like,
no.
oh yeah, if it's Italian sounding, it's going to be a mob story. If it's,
Oh, jeez.
vaguely a Muslim or Asian, it's going to be a different story. If it's a woman, it's a different story. Like there's so much like variability and unpredictability, right? And then it's like, yeah, it's funny. Yeah, it's funny. Like a friend of mine has an Italian name, and then it invented the story about him being like a mob boss. Yeah, haha, right? But like, what happens when you plug this model into like a chatbot
Yeah.
or whatever, right? A virtual assistant, and you have your kid talking to it, and your kid's like, "Tell me a story," and it's like, well, you know. So, and then like the more research we do, we realize that it's biased against, races. It's biased against genders, and it's like, but it's also like always post hoc. It's like, oh, this is an issue. We didn't realize this was an issue. I was reading a report recently that was saying the bias again, it was like saying that certain racial populations had a bias against them in terms of GPT, and they were like, but it's consistent with statistics from the Bureau of whatever crime bureau of the U.S.
Uh-huh.
saying that African Americans are responsible for X% of crimes, and then that's what our model shows, so it's okay. And I was like,
No.
how is that okay? What? If you query your model with an African sounding name and it's racist, it's okay, right? Like it
Yeah.
just blows my mind.
Oh, wow. Well, I had no idea. And that is, yeah, I could see that can be a problem very quickly.
Yeah, and we don't
Now,
know exactly how to analyze these models yet. So I think that before we start, continue with GPT-4 and GPT-18, we should take a pause, take a breath, and start, going deeper into these models and how they work and querying them a bit and making them a bit more transparent. And
mm,
then, once we have an architecture that's a bit more explainable, then we can continue building. But if we keep going this direction, we're going to have bigger models that are harder and harder to explain, and that people just take as a given, as like this black box of
yeah.
magic machine learning, which is not necessarily true.
Yeah, you're building a house of cards, right? It's the
Mhm.
foundation is not strong at all. And so one day it's going to all tumble down. And that is yeah, that is an interesting one to look at. Now, what about for the other side? I mean, aside from your own work, what are some other things that you've seen that are inspirational uses of machine learning and AI?
I think that the climate change AI community is really rallying. So we've got more and more people joining, more and more people working on this, more and more people wanting to get involved. Like last week, I was speaking at a hackathon of using climate change AI to tackle climate change, and there was like something like 300 or 400 people signed up, and I think that this is becoming an actual wave, an actual momentum. So that's really great, and people are realizing of the potential that's there. And in general, I feel that AI for good is becoming a thing. Like I was just reading the news that some philanthropic organization donated, I don't know, $40 million toward AI for good applications. I think this is also
Mhm.
becoming a trend that's really important, and that typically AI has been for the kind of the upper middle class minority, right? And a lot of we've left a lot of people behind. So now it's high time to start making more inclusive AI applications, more diverse AI applications, including more voices. There's a really interesting field of work that's like aiming to decolonialize AI to make it less
Mhm.
white, less male, less global north. That I find is really important because I mean, there's a lot of kind of anecdotal evidence of like because most AI practitioners or programmers are white male, it's reflected in the technology that's made, and that's true. And so we really need to make it more diverse and make it more reflective of society as a whole. So people are doing really interesting research in that direction.
It's funny you say that because we had on this show Lewis Bird, and he talked a lot about how, well, he wrote an incredible article, and then he came on here and I interviewed him about how he had to code switch, or what he called put on his white voice when he talked to Siri or Alexa,
Yeah,
because Alexa, or it was Brigsby. What's the other one? That's
yeah,
I don't know,
one of
one
the
of the
assistants.
voice, yeah, assistants, and they didn't understand him. And then one day he like spoke in a different way, and then it was easier to understand. And all of a sudden, Alexa magically started understanding him. And it was very much like our Charles, I think, who you may know, he spoke about this once too, and he talked about how right now it feels like the band-aid that we're putting on top of this is by saying, "Oh, well, we'll just get Samuel L. Jackson to do a Siri voice." Right. And that's like basically, he was saying that's basically like, what was it? Like painting blackface,
Yeah, for sure.
and it's like the virtual blackface. And so that is another one where, yeah, I can see that being, there needs to be more things going on, and it's good to see that there are people interested in this, and there's things going on, and you can attest to that.
Yes.
I wanted to ask last, well, not the final question, but how can people get involved in some of these initiatives that you're speaking about?
So I think that there's no one size fits all solution, but essentially figuring out what you have to offer, whether it be time or skills or whatever it is, and finding people around you in your community that can benefit from them. So a few years ago, we organized an AI for Good hackathon in Montreal, and first we were like, oh, we're going to do neural networks, we're going to help charities predict whatever, and then we realized what they actually needed first was like digital literacy classes. So we gave them classes about how to gather data, how to use Excel, how to use, kind of tools. And then a year later we came back and they had some data for us. And then we can start predicting like, I don't know, demand in homeless shelters or food kitchens or whatever. So I think that, taking a step back and being like, okay, this is what I can do. But I mean, like, I can also use a computer. I can also do all these things, and then see what people need and not come with this kind of like bigger is better, more AI is better mentality. So, and you'd be surprised at what demand there is. It could be a virtual community, it could be a physical community, but in general, that there are things demand that can be met.
Yeah. And as far as the climate change, if someone wants to get involved in that?
Yeah, I think reading the paper or looking at the website that we created, climatechange.ai, and seeing what makes sense. So once again, there's so many things to be done that depending on if people are interested in satellite imagery or agriculture or whatnot, right? And then seeing who's already working on it and what they're doing. So doing kind of a literature review and starting small, starting with like either a smaller data set, like for example, in your municipality, sometimes they have data sets that you can use and predict. For example, like, I don't know, there's data sets of canopy coverage, right? And you can see the correlation between the number of trees and heat pockets in your city or something like that's just pretty small or in your county or in your region, and kind of working your way up. But I think it's good to start with like a bite-sized piece that you can kind of understand and start getting more acquainted with concepts and tools, and then after that kind of build up, but not try to start with like, I'm going to solve climate change. Like that's typically something that will get you more frustrated than anything. But and then like we actually met with the city of Montreal a few months ago. Well, I mean, actually before the pandemic, and they told us this is the kind of things that we need. So if you have people around you that can help us, for example, predict heat pockets in correlation with trees, this is something that we could really be used in our projections. And so we started doing projects and hackathons and things like that. So but it was a very bottom up approach. It was really like them telling us what they need. And this can be done on any level. It can be done on university level, on company level, on government level.
Again, it goes back to, let me see if I can articulate this thought properly, but it goes back to the idea of finding the problem, not like just solving for a better accuracy score, right?
Exactly.
Like really realize what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and then go out and solve that.
Yeah. And who can benefit from it, and make sure that there's somebody who can actually use your solution, that it's not just going to like go poof and like just be a paper or a presentation or an article or something,
Uh-huh.
but it's going to be an actual like tool for someone, or useful for someone who can actually take action on it later.
So, at the very least, everyone who's listening can go and share a picture of their house on fire on TikTok and
Yes.
let their friends know that this is a real possibility. So, we got to act now.
Mhm.
And the last question I have for you, Sasha, is, are you a robot?
I feel like I'm a robot before I get my coffee in the morning, but otherwise, I think I'm a human being.
Perfect. Well, it's been a blast talking to you. I really thank you for coming on here and enlightening me to all of the different things that you're working on. I am, wow, my hat's off to you because you're doing so much incredible work.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.